Miss Lenore Three Stars is Oglala, Lakota, and was born on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where her father was born. Her mother is Minikoshu, Lakota, from the Cheyenne River Reservation in South Dakota. Lenore earned her BA from Fort Lewis College in Colorado, then completed a civil rights career in Seattle, Washington. When she retired, she moved to Spokane to be an active onchi, grandmother, to her two tecojas, grandkids, and began her graduate studies. Lenore speaks and writes from a native perspective on decolonizing theology and racial reconciliation. She serves on boards related to her interests in justice, the local community, indigenous issues, and a discipleship of creation care. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lenore Three Stars.
Okay, I think I'm hooked up. Hold this one too. Well, I prefer that whether we're next to each other. Let's pray. Guide and help us, we pray. May these words and our time together honor you, Creator Jesus, and unite us in your spirit. Well, greetings, Mitakuyapi. Before I introduce myself, I'd like to begin with a protocol of respect that is observed by Indigenous peoples around the world, which is a land acknowledgement. By land, I include the plants and the waters and the creatures. Thank you, Duke, for recognizing that a land acknowledgement is important. I read the online land acknowledgement, and it's very brief, but it acknowledges the Shakori, the Eno, and the Tuscarora ancestors for this area. I'd like to dissuade any notion that it is superficial to acknowledge the original hosts of ancestral lands, no matter where you are. As a Lakota living in Spokane, I also am a guest. I'm living in the land of the Spokane people, and I honor their salmon culture and their ancient relationship with the land. It's important to recognize Indigenous hosts and their ancestral lands because they are still here. History and politics and Disney would erase them, but the land remembers them. The land is a witness that those ancestors lived there for thousands of years. In fact, most creation stories will say that we were always here. We were created here. And finally, a proper land recognition is essential for relationship and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, as it contradicts the dehumanizing ideology of the doctrine of discovery that denied Indigenous peoples their dignity and their land. So I say, let the truth be heard for healing. Now may I introduce myself. My name is Lenore Three Stars. I'm Oglala Lakota, one of the 7 bands of the Lakota that make up the Teton division of the Ocheti Shakowee, which is the 7 council fires, also known as the Great Sioux Nation. My father was Oglala Lakota, born on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is where I was born, and my mother's Minikoju Lakota, one of the other bands from Cheyenne River Reservation, also in South Dakota. Our ancestral lands include Hesaba, which is the Black Hills of South Dakota, where our creation story lives. Now, I take time to introduce myself in terms of kinship Because in Lakota culture, the family system, the Teyoshbaye, is foundational. It shapes our kinship roles in traditional society. So I know that when other natives ask me, where are you from? What they're really asking me is, who are your people? And then my answer will explain my relationship to the land. Because that sense of place is a very important part of Native identity. So when I speak to groups, I try to bridge Native and non-Native understanding by talking about an Indigenous worldview and how that relates to a theology of a land and place. I share a bit of my personal story because it may help you see through my lens an Indigenous perspective of the gospel story. There is no such thing as a culture-free gospel. We all come from somewhere that shapes our worldview and forms the lens through which we see and experience life. We all have worldviews. When I called you Mitakuyapi, my relatives, I was expressing a Lakota worldview, a way of being that we call Mitakuyenyasi. So Mitakuyenyasi translates to all my relations, and it means that we are all related. We're related to Creator, we're related to each other, and we are related to all creation, even the non-human parts of creation, the stars, the elements of weather included. So when we call all parts of creation our relatives, we're drawing respect into that relationship. Many of my Native friends have told me that they have that same kind of worldview in their tribes and in their own language. So we are all related. In this worldview, we have the duty to be good relatives. Very basic. When right relationship is broken, it's our responsibility to find a way to restore that, to bring back balance and harmony, because that's what a good relative would do. So what makes us related? Scripture supports this way of thinking. For instance, in Genesis 28, Creator made a promise to Jacob, all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and your offspring. And Romans 8 tells us that the Spirit of God brought about our adoption as children of God. That the Lakota creation story says in part that Ea, the spirit or force of creation that has no gender, made all parts of creation bit by bit using its blood, and that made us relatives. I was an adult when I said yes to Creator Jesus, not understanding that for the next 20-some years, I would be formed by Euro-Western Christianity, a religion with a history of imposing a Eurocultural template for Christianizing and civilizing Native peoples. So I learned how to be an Orthodox white Christian woman who knew correct beliefs. Over time, though, I became aware that I didn't fit in. My theology was Eurocentric, but the rest of me wasn't. I began asking Jesus, couldn't I follow you as a Lakota woman? And the answer came when I learned about a seminary with Indigenous theological studies taught by Indigenous instructors. I was relieved to learn that most of my spiritual stress and cultural conflict stemmed from a conflict in worldviews, a difference of worldviews. I wasn't having a faith crisis, I was having a clash of worldviews. I learned that generally Western Christianity is shaped by a Western European worldview with Hellenistic influences. One's mind and beliefs had more meaning than physical experience or what one does. And I saw that theology is more often what you believe or think and not what you do. This worldview conflicts with an Indigenous worldview, which is integrated and holistic. The way you live is what you believe. Without that Gnostic dualism that separates spiritual and material realities, Indigenous stories and teachings are moral. They tell us how to be a good relative. My clash of worldviews created a dissonance that I couldn't ignore between correct religious beliefs and indigenous thinking. So a few examples of this are kingdom analogies. Kings and kingdoms don't relate to a native cultural context. So I often wondered if we couldn't express what we mean by that in a way that doesn't imply empire or conquest. I had come to Christianity as an adult from a zeitgeist of protest against broken treaties. So this conquest language was troublesome. But thanks to Randy Woodley's book, Shalom and the Community of Creation, when I read Kingdom now, I can think Shalom Kingdom. Another example is exegeting Genesis with mankind as the pinnacle of creation, with dominion overall, with hierarchical power to treat Earth as a commodity or a resource, rather than as a relative. As we look around, we can see that this Western economic worldview is destructive and unsustainable. In fact, what I've heard here is that we admit that sustainability feels like a loss. That's a norm we can change. We have created a perfect storm for a climate disaster. And this third example I heard again recently, this world is not our home, we're just passing through it. That worldview devalues creation and the sacredness and our responsibility to Earth. Anishinaabe author Winona LaDuke was spot on when she said, in Christianity, the people and the land are no longer relatives. So it doesn't matter what we do here, because salvation is in the next world, someplace else. So let them mine and extract here. There are many dualisms in Western Christianity, heaven versus hell, individualism versus community, sacred versus secular. And those were all stressful to my faith life. For instance, I learned against my cultural upbringing that in school I should raise my hand and draw attention to myself and demonstrate that I was smarter than somebody else. This individualistic value carries over into the workplace and into the church. It contradicts the indigenous value that community is essential. What I learn should make me a good relative. What is good for me should be good for my family and good for my community. And if my theology doesn't make me a good relative, then I need a better theology. Church taught me that it was idolatry to consider an eagle feather sacred or a native song or dance as sacred, because only Jesus can be sacred. Missiologists, please understand that reverence, cultural reverence, is not the same thing as worshiping a god. Without culture competency in these things, Western judgments of syncretism are ethnocentric. The thinking that your culture is the standard for all cultures is colonialism. John 3:8 says that the Spirit is free and goes where it wills, including into indigenous cultures. So these kinds of propositional truths told me that there must be something wrong with my native culture and with me being Indian. I didn't find my cultural identity in church, and it became one more place, like a public school, where I learned to accommodate my native identity to whiteness. In fact, I learned to assimilate myself, because that's how oppression works. I became a tool in my own oppression and blamed myself for it. So of course it was inevitable that one day I would want to follow Jesus from my real context of being a Native woman. The Western Church offered me a theology of assimilation when I needed a theology of wholeness. To quote Franciscan sister Archambault, a Lakota nun, she said, there is neither beauty nor justice in a gospel wrapped in European culture. The moment Christianity becomes real for First Nations is when it is incarnated and accepted into their worldview, and not until then. So though I hadn't yet heard of the term decolonization, I knew that I wanted to exfoliate those layers of my Christian formation that came from an outside culture until I got to a creator who knows me. I was ready to learn from Indigenous instructors who had already experienced that same spiritual struggle. So you may hear Native believers refer to Creator. Well, I came to understand Jesus as Creator. The presence and agency of Jesus in the act of creation is affirmed in John 1:3. Through him all things were made. And in Colossians 1:16, for in him all things were created, heaven on earth, visible and invisible. All things have been created through him and for him. So my experience is with Creator Jesus. I could see my identity in his incarnation as a brown indigenous tribal relative, even if the church couldn't. So this theological worldview of Mitakuye Oyansi brings us to a theology of the land. Indigenous peoples have a theology of the land that Western culture usually does not. Since I'm related to all creation, Earth is my relative, not property that I dominate. The spiritual connection is so old and deep that we belong to the land. The theology of the land includes our creation stories, which tells us who we are and where we came from. And the Lakota creation story says in part that our ancient ones emerged from the earth in Kesapa, the Black Hills, the place we call the heart of everything that is. In Lakota, we call Earth Inamaka, Mother Earth, or Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth. And those are both kinship terms of deep respect. So I appreciate the thinking of author George Tinker that Native creation stories are our history of experiencing Jesus as Creator, who communicated healing and salvation to all his creation. Kesapa is the specific homeland that we are responsible to care for, as it cared for us for millennia. That's a reciprocal relationship. We are rooted to that one specific place. It's our land covenant, and it's not portable. Today it's called the Black Hills National Forest, owned by the government, but it's still sacred land to us. Ceremonies are still carried out there, seeking balance and renewal on behalf of all creation. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 promised the Ochedee-Shakowee exclusive use of Kesapa, but when gold was discovered there, the government took it back. In 1941, Mount Rushmore was carved where Tungashila Shakpe, the six grandfathers, once stood. In 1980, the Supreme Court decided that the government took the land without just compensation and awarded the Ochedee-Shakowee $14 million to pay for the land. To this day, despite pockets of deep poverty, the Ochedee-Shakowee has not accepted that money, which is up to $1.3 billion with interest now, because of a worldview that the Western world can't understand, that you can't own or sell your relative, Unchimaka. We'd rather have our sacred land, our place, back. Indigenous people everywhere hold a deep identification and relationship with the land. They are a part of creation, not above it. Pulitzer author N. Scott Momaday, who is Kiowa, said, "You can't separate the Native American from the landscape. It is his spirit." So our spirituality is embodied in the land. So, of course, we find theology in Scripture. The second Hebrew creation story from Genesis 2 says that Adam was created from Adama, the earth in Hebrew. So this seems to say to me that he was the land. Or perhaps another way to say that we are related to Inamaka, Mother Earth. This connection, this relationship we have to the land is meant to be deep. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Jesus' teachings reflected an ancient Semitic worldview that all creation is sacred. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. That's a theology of the land. An indigenous theology of the land is reciprocal, as I mentioned, care and respect. One doesn't take something without giving something back, and you don't take more than you need. If you're walking along and you see a pretty rock, you don't just pick it up and take it home because you can. You ask permission and you leave a gift. There's a difference between living on the land and living with the land. So these two thoughts, worldview and theology of the land, lay the groundwork for understanding how completely devastating the doctrine of discovery was on indigenous peoples and their lands. Now, we might think of the doctrine of discovery as a period in history, but it still lives. Centuries later, it continues to oppress indigenous peoples today. Briefly, the doctrine of discovery sanctified genocide and theft in the 15th century when the popes authorized exploring monarchies to, and I quote, capture, vanquish, and subdue the pagans of new lands, put them into perpetual slavery, and take all their possessions and property. So this vile ideology actually got to decide who got to be human. And indigenous, non-white peoples had no human rights. They were denied their humanity and their land because they were not Christian. And this ideology is what author and Professor Soong-Chan Rah calls a diseased theological imagination that enacted a narrative of white supremacy. In 1776, America presumed that it became a successor nation to the right of discovery and dominion from Great Britain, and the Supreme Court made it legal. In 1823, the Supreme Court reached the landmark decision in Johnson versus McIntosh when it cited the doctrine of discovery to rule that indigenous peoples had no right to property title. They could not legally own their ancestral lands. So stripping property rights from Native people made it easy for the government to claim the land and begin ethnic cleansing. Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 caused tribes to be killed or violently removed from their ancestral homelands. Manifest destiny was a phrase coined in 1845, and it was the idea that the United States is destined by God to expand its dominion across the entire continent of North America. So one thing became very clear to me: we were never intended to survive. As Dr. Andrea Smith wrote, our role as natives in the narrative of white supremacy is to always be disappearing. Blood quantum requirements and other congressional acts of colonization are trying to erase us so that we won't be visual reminders of this country's genocide and land theft. Ethnic cleansing prevented the government to legally steal land that had been occupied by indigenous inhabitants for thousands of years. Some historians estimate that up to 100 million indigenous peoples with systems of medicine and economy and agriculture and astronomy lived here at the time of European contact. It was never empty land occupied by savages. So this Indian boarding school issue that you're going to be hearing a lot more of exemplifies the doctrine's deadly legacy. We will be hearing more about this as the demand grows to find and rematriate the missing remains of children who died in boarding schools, to return them to their lands. The boarding schools were a key strategy in forced assimilation. I have ancestors on both sides of my family that went to boarding schools. In the U.S. between 1869 and 1960, have updated these figures, 408 schools in 37 states. So overall, it's estimated that over 150,000 Native kids went to boarding schools, and the deaths are estimated up to 40,000. The government transferred the administration of these boarding schools, these labor camps, over to church denominations. and Christian people who knew the correct beliefs of Imago Dei didn't apply it to Native children. Orthodoxy trumped orthopraxy. They were able to compartmentalize their theology in favor of the racialized ideology of the doctrine of discovery. Some settlers said that they wanted to evangelize natives, but colonizing for Jesus has always been about the land. Land is a profitable commodity, not as a relative. So this cruel experiment in assimilation created intergenerational trauma that we are still trying to heal from. The boarding schools destroyed the traditional indigenous pattern of raising children, which for them is to learn the essential skills and the values and the language from the right relatives at the right times in the land of their creation stories. Land that has names and meanings. Grandparents, aunties, and uncles all had a role in raising children, and that pattern was broken in boarding schools. The surviving children were raised in horrific trauma, and they just passed that on to the next generation. But the trauma didn't end when the boarding schools closed or the massacres stopped. Descendants carried a blood memory, now referred to as epigenetics. Scientific studies show that the inherited DNA and the epigenetic instructions that ride the DNA like a ghost gene convey transgenerational trauma, HTR, historical trauma response. So this is a biological explanation for the inherited effects of colonial trauma. HDR can also be seen in descendants of African slaves, Japanese internees, and Holocaust victims, and I think will most likely be seen in the descendants of the brown children at the borders who were separated from their parents. As we reclaim our cultures, we begin to heal from colonial health deficits. Today, the massive lie of the doctrine of discovery continues to oppress indigenous peoples around the world. Sarah Augustine wrote in her book, The Land is Not Empty, that the same process that unfolded in North America 150 years ago is happening today around the world. Indigenous peoples still have no legal claims to their ancestral lands and are being poisoned, brutalized, and removed by extractive industries for the land and resources. Water protectors in America are now criminalized for protesting against oil pipelines to protect the relatives, the water, the land, the creatures. Butterfly defenders in Mexico, forest defenders in Ecuador, rainforest protectors in the Amazon, they're all being murdered to enable land theft and extraction. And these are consequences of laws based on the doctrine of discovery. From an indigenous perspective, there is a strong correlation between how the land is treated and how women are treated. Traditionally, women are honored as life and culture carriers. In today's extractive economic worldview, 1 in 3 Native women in America have experienced rape, and Native women are murdered up to 10 times the national rate. This has created a nightmare called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. There's a jurisdictional maze of tribal, state, and federal authorities that creates dead ends for families who are looking for their missing loved ones. We're beginning to make a small step with the reauthorization of violence against women, but the burden is falling on families to try and find their own loved ones. We also have broken right relationship with the natural world with our toxic ways. A few years ago in the Pacific Northwest, we saw a mother orca grieve her dead calf for 17 days. She carried her calf's body through 1,000 miles of water, lifting it up for everyone to see. She was carrying a message for anyone who had ears to hear. Lament is a ceremonial response by all creation to the reality of suffering. Our toxic ways are poisoning the community of creation, including ourselves. We are daily confronted by racism, dehumanization, patriarchy, and white supremacy. We are in a never-ending lament over the relatives who have been murdered by white supremacy. Leviticus 18 warns us that the land can become defiled by the actions of the people, and the land vomits them out. What happens when people do not live in a good way? Unchimaka is working hard to find balance as we see extreme weather, earthquakes, loss of species, and climate distress. I don't for a minute forget that Unchimaka can survive without mankind. Sung Chang Ra, author of Prophetic Lament, asked, are we hearing the voices of the marginalized, those who are suffering? Or are we hearing the voices of the privileged speaking for the marginalized? I automatically include Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth, as one of those suffering voices, and it's imperative that we listen. I pray that we can see the world through the magnitude of Creator's lens of interdependent relationships throughout all creation. Everything is connected. That's why I pray. To me, living in this world is not about a linear orthodoxy of waiting for restoration at the end. It's about the continuous orthopraxy of finding balance in the community of creation, of being a good relative now. So let me close with a Shalom vision of a Lakota Wichashawakan, black elk. In the old days, when we were a strong and happy people, all our power came to us from the sacred hoop of the nation. And so long as the hoop was unbroken, the people flourished. The flowering tree was the center of the hoop, and the circle of the four quarters nourished it. The east gave peace and light, the south gave warmth, the west gave rain, and the north, with its cold and mighty wind, gave endurance. Then as a young man, Black Elk witnessed the massacre at Wounded Knee in December 1890, the Army turned Hotchkiss guns on 250 Minikoju Lakota, my mother's people, who were traveling in bitter winter to Pine Ridge Camp for food and shelter. Pine Ridge, my people, my father's people. And I'm here today because my great-grandmother survived that massacre, and she persevered by raising another generation of Lakota. The horror of witnessing Wounded Knee Massacre caused Black Elk to lament. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream, but the nation's hoop is broken and scattered. There is no center any longer, and the sacred tree is dead. Years later, he asked, is there still some little root of the tree that lives? Can the nation's hoop be healed? Revelations 22, Jesus says, I am the root. To let us know I am the healing. I am the salvation healing. Verse 2 says, the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And for me, the nations includes the horse nation, the buffalo nation, all creation. Never again will anything be cursed, it says. So the tree of life that we saw in the creation garden, the tree that Black Elk saw in his Shalom vision, is the same present again in the Shalom healed earth. For me, I like to think that my eternal story lives in the healed homelands of my people. Every tongue, nation, and tribe will be there. And that tells me that I will be fully fluent in Lakota. I'll tell a joke in Lakota and everybody will get it. That's how you know you're fluent. Until then, Father Stephen Charleston's picture prayer encourages me. On that day, on that wonderful day, the sun will be shining in the morning sky. The breeze will be fresh with the scent of rain, and the trees will stand waiting like footmen in their coats of green. Then a shout of joy will begin. On the far side of earth it begins, and rings around the world until all the tribes of all living things will be crying out together, crying out in glad adoration. Peace will have come at last. Peace in every way for every living thing a peace that will never again be broken. On that day, Mother Earth will receive her redemption. The ancestors will walk with us once again. The hoop of the nation will be mended. It will be a day unlike any other. Not since the first star was born will there ever be a day like the one that is coming when the Spirit gathers all of creation as a mother gathers her young. Tungashila, Wopila Tonkai Chichie. We give you all our thanks, Creator.
Amen.